Hello YouTube, welcome back. Going for a little twilight walk through Parramatta Park, and it's only been a little while since my last video, but something's come up and we need to talk. In my last video I talked about a letter from Marquee to its growers which had a bit of a somber tone about the pricing and supply and that sort of stuff, and indicating that they'd probably hold their notional price for growers. I've now been able to put that in a wider perspective based on something else that's come up. But first of all, let's look at the 2025 crop and what's gone wrong with it. We started in spring with rain during the flowering period, which is never good because it can cause flower diseases and wash off pollen that reduces pollination rates. So we had all that. We had flower blight destroying some flower, and apparently, anecdotally, that happened a lot in Queensland as well. There's a theory that broad mite, which is it's a pest that's been around for a while, but is perhaps becoming more prevalent, that broad mite actually had a role to play in damaging some flowers or damaging some nut set. We also had, as I sort of mentioned in other videos, we also had a problem with pollinators, in that it seemed like the bees weren't visiting the good flowers that remained to the same extent as they do in a normal year. These are all things I've dealt with in my shows. We then had a spring that was really quite wet and cloudy. Not a lot of sun to pour carbohydrates into the growing nuts. We've then suffered Tropical Cyclone Alfred, which blew trees around a bit, dropped some nut early, and a lot of surrounding cloudy and wet weather, which put a lot of debris on the ground, making it hard to prepare the surface for harvesting. We then had a whole stack of rain in March, which turned our harvest surface into mud, and all of a sudden the idea of harvesting our crop became even more difficult than it already was. So what's that resulted in? Well, a number of things. What the processors have discovered since is that the nuts they're being delivered are smaller and that there's lower kernel recovery. Now, the smaller nuts may not mean too much to you, but the ideal sort of size nut, which is about 22 millimeters across in shell, when you reduce that by even 1 millimeter, that can mean 10% less kernel for the processors. So small nuts relative to the normal size actually means a hell of a lot to them, even if it doesn't look overly different to the farmer. They're discovering more shell and less kernel. Again, a product, I think, of a lack of sunlight. There's plenty of water, of course, so there's been no lack of water to feed the crop, but you also need sun to make that macadamia oil, which is hydrocarbon. The quality has been lower, mainly because farmers have had to dig nuts out of mud, or at least harvest a long time after the nuts have fallen, and that means quality can be less than optimal. You're getting increased incidence of mold, discoloration, in some cases immaturity from nuts that were dropped too early by the winds, and overall lower yield. And that's either partly from the lack of pollination that we talked about, or from the fact that, the harvesters are just not picking up all the nuts. Some of them have sunk into muddy ground, never to be seen again. Those are problems that aren't just in the Northern Rivers either. The Northern Rivers has copped it badly, and I should include the Glasshouse Mountains, which, it's not the Northern Rivers, but they have the same issues of volcanic soil and hills, and they also had a bit of a dose from Tropical Cyclone Alfred as well, and they get a fair bit of Northern Rivers weather. So, the smaller nuts are all around, and the higher shell related to kernel is all around, and in particular in Queensland the kernel recovery has been disappointing. So these are all the things that have gone wrong with the 2025 season. And yet, when they did revise the crop forecast down in response to apparently these very problems, they only revised it down by 1,000 tonnes. And that, I'm assured, is about to change, and quite quickly, probably within the space of the next week. Again, watch this space. Happy to eat my words, as I said in my last video. But I think we can guarantee that the crop forecast is going to come down quite substantially, which of course it should have been some time ago. These are all things I've mentioned before, and obviously I don't mean to sort of ruin your day at all, but something else has cropped up and it's a bit of a worry. And this is what the marquee letter was effectively responding to. On the 19th of June, Wally's Nuts came out with a letter to their growers describing all of these problems, saying, you know, and bear in mind, Wally's is largely a New South Wales processor, relying on New South Wales farmers to supply it. So because of our particular problems in the Northern Rivers with weather and that sort of thing, they got hit particularly hard by a lack of supply coming from New South Wales farmers. As a result of that, they've been unable to fulfil their contracts. They have customers seeking damages under supply agreements where they were promising to supply a certain amount of nut and then didn't. And, you know, they've had to, in some cases, cancel contracts and look to sell nuts elsewhere on the open market. So the letter goes into all of that and then says that as a result of that, they can't hold their notional price that they promised to their growers at the start of the year. That notional price was, as I recall, $4 even. So it wasn't the best price in the market, wasn't the worst, but it was a notional price. It's what they've dropped it to now that stunned me. They've gone from $4 to $2.10. Now, that takes us back to near the worst ever pricing that we ever got back a couple of years ago, and certainly below 2024's price, which were in the threes. So to drop it by nearly half is to basically take away the farmer's rights to any further payments for nuts that were paid out on the initial payment, because the Wally's payment plan says we'll pay you 50%. 50% is basically $2, and they're now changing the price to $2.10. That applies retrospectively to the crop that you've already supplied. So a lot of the Wally's growers are now basically faced with the idea that they won't get much more in terms of payments for the nuts they've already shipped. In addition to the change in notional price, Wally's have suspended the program of payments that they had in their contract, and they've said we're going to change the time for paying you for the rest of your nuts. And they don't have a time frame yet, but they say we'll get back to you and tell you what that is, or what that's going to be. Now, look, I mean, I could lecture everyone on the perils of a notional price and say, look, this is what can happen. But I have to say, I don't think this has ever happened, not to this extent, to have a notional price change by so much that effectively you're barely being paid more than half of what you were originally promised. Now, Wally's in their letter said, you know, we're prepared to release everyone from their contractual obligations and you don't have to ship us any more nuts. I think they probably could have left that unsaid and people still wouldn't do it. And they've said you're free to make arrangements with other suppliers. We want to close the 2025 season early because it's been basically a wipeout for them. And they've also said that they're looking to sell the business, which perhaps isn't surprising, but you know, the fact that they're suspending payments, that they're almost halving the notional price, none of that bodes particularly well for many Wally's growers. Now, other processors are fielding phone calls. You know, the shortage of nuts is a blessing in the sense that there are plenty of other processors willing to take nuts from the former Wally's growers. CL Max has put a post up in a forum saying, CL Max is ready to take Wally's growers and pay the fixed price offering that they offered at the start of the season. There's another letter from Suncoast Gold saying, look, we're suffering very similar difficulties. We're not changing the notional price at this point, but it's very important that you get all your nuts in and that we get as many nuts as possible. Even the marquee letter, reading between the lines, has a little bit of bum covering built into it, in that you wonder whether that notional price will be held if the particular thing goes pear-shaped. Is there a reason? I mean, if you're not a Wally's nuts grower, is there a reason for panic? Look, I don't think so. Wally's was in a unique position, as in it was a New South Wales only nut processor. It suffered from the lack of crop in New South Wales. It's also largely a nut and shell to China shipper, and to some extent perhaps a victim of its contractual obligations to customers in China who were expecting a lot of nuts by now and who aren't getting them for the fact that the New South Wales crop has failed so dismally. And look, I think, I've harped on about this once too often, but it is important to have real crop forecasts and not political ones, because in situations like this, where processors can end up promising too much crop compared to what's likely to be actually harvested. Wally's has really come a cropper here. And if they sell the business or whatever else, then obviously they've got some hearts and minds to win back, particularly from the die-hard Wally's growers who've, some of them have been around a long time. Wally's has been around 30 years in one form or another. And they say they've never reduced the notional price. They've always copped any shortfall out of their own pocket. And in my experience, that's true. They were also, the gold standard in that they used to pay everyone for their nuts within 30 days of shipment, including any bonuses. And that used to be what Wally's were famous for. I went with them for a while on that very same promise to get some early payment for nuts, and they were perfectly reliable. They had good people, friendly people to deal with, including my old mate Garth, who was a grower liaison there for a while. But to have this happen, even in an isolated incident, even in an incident that we can explain on the basis of Wally's own predicament, is a shake to the industry. It's not a good look. I've spoken to other processors who agree that, it's not great for anyone, any other processor, and that perhaps it might have been handled differently, and that, had they reached out to other processors, they might have been able to do something to alleviate Wally's shortfall of nuts, although no one's really sort of overflowing with nuts at the moment in terms of filling contracts or taking over other nut processors' contracts. However it's turned out, it has turned out badly for Wally's nuts growers, and I know that they're at the moment, a lot of them are trying to jump ship to other processors who'll gladly have them, but it is also a lesson, I suppose, in hindsight, about notional pricing. I don't see any real objective justification to change the notional price by so much when there is actually a shortage of nuts. But the particular deals Wally signed up with mean that they can probably justify it under the contract, and that is the issue with notional pricing. They get to determine what conditions change the price and what the new price is. The growers don't get a say in that. And the answer, if you want to avoid that sort of thing, is to take a fixed price from a processor with a lot of financial clout, who can wear a loss if that's what they incur, and give you the fixed price regardless of how the market turns out. And again, I've said it before, these processors are not buyers. They're not sales agents. It's not a matter of getting you a good price and then handing it on to you. They are buyers, and they should pay a fair price to farmers. If they've made bad business decisions, it should be on them, but the notional price means that it can be passed on to the growers, and Wally's growers are feeling that right now. Again, I don't know what the AMS is doing about this. You would wonder whether there might be a good role to mediate any particular dispute between growers and Wally's about this change in notional price. There's probably more that's going to happen, but I don't know quite where it will go in terms of what Wally's farmers might have recourse to. But I wanted to get the news out there. This is why, you know, we need proper crop forecasting, and this is why we need to read the competing offers from processors very carefully and work out what risk a farmer wants to take by way of trade-off of price and security in terms of keeping that price. Sad to bring you that update, but it's important news, and I thought you needed to know. I'll catch you again soon, hopefully with something a fair bit happier. Bye for now.